Brilliant. All right. Hello and welcome everyone to today's live panel discussion on the topic of systemic design. I'm extremely excited to be joined today by a fantastic panel who are all very much involved in pioneering this field from various different angles. But before I introduce today's speakers, I'll start with a bit of context into why we believe this discussion is so important and what it means for our listeners today, as well as introduce the structure of today's discussion. And so to introduce some context, as the systems we design become ever more complex and the need for more sustainable outcomes rises, systems design or systemic design is emerging as a promising approach to this design need. It's an approach that takes a more holistic and complete account of the diversity of actors and elements that constitute the design of a complex system, such as a city, an airport, a healthcare system, an information system, or any number of different services. And systemic design goes beyond industrial age design, which was focused more on kind of products and features, as well as design thinking that focuses attention on the end user experience. And instead, it starts from the perspective of the whole system, i.e. how to design for synergies between the parts, the networks, as well as design for the emergence of sustainable outcomes. And so the practice of systemic design has been very dynamic and evolved quite a lot over the past decades. And so in this 1 hour discussion, we have brought together some leading practitioners in this field with the hope to shed light on what we mean by this idea behind systemic design and how we can approach the design of complex systems to realize sustainable outcomes. And we'll aim to leave about 10 minutes or so at the end for audience questions. So, do post on the YouTube, next to the YouTube video, or any comments as and when they come up. We'd love to hear from you. And so to discuss this topic with us today, we are joined by Tom Bossart, who is the founder and director at Accept, which is a design firm which develops and implements strategies to make cities, buildings, companies, and industries and day-to-day life more resilient, more sustainable, and more human. And Tom has recently developed a comprehensive methodology called symbiosis in development, which combines systems thinking, complexity analysis, iterative design thinking, and co-creation in multidisciplinary teams, and has shared this as a free ebook. And Virginie Gailing, we have next, who is a co-designer and permaculturist. She is teaching systemic design and participatory and transformation design at the Design Akademie of Berlin. And she's also a collaborator at the Systemic Design Group, which is a community of practice who seeks to make systems thinking more approachable. And finally, we have Christel van Eyl, who is a designer and creative director of the Namen Design Agency, which specializes in human-centered design and is one of the leading agencies when it comes to digital user experience and service design. Christel also teaches product service systems and systemic design at the University of Antwerp. And her firm has also released a systemic design toolkit, which summarizes some of the core principles and provides templates for the process of systemic design, which is freely available and is also something I've attached in the description. And so before I move on to our first question, I'd like to just have a quick look and just share the results of our Twitter poll we just shared minutes earlier to get a sense of people's familiarity with systemic design. It'll be interesting to see what the results were of that. So it looks like, so we have 4 questions. The first is, I'm not familiar with it. That was 14%, are relatively new. I've heard of it, I'm able to explain it. So this is the bulk. So this is about 40% for both questions. People have heard about it and or are able to explain it to friends, and a small percentage who would consider themselves an expert. So most people here falling in the middle of the category, some level of familiarity. So that's really helpful just as some context for the discussion. Brilliant. And so, yeah, to move on to our first question, I'd love to hear from the panelists today. How would you describe this field of systemic design, and how would you describe your own relationship to the subject? So, Christelle, would you like to start?
Yes, well, systemic design is basically a fusion between human-centered design and systems thinking. And the reason that we need this now is because as designers, we want to have more impact on the world, but also the world needs more impactful solutions, because we are too much making just products and services that are having unintended consequences, and we should stop doing this. And so basically by systemic design, you start to look at product and services as leverage points in the system.
Brilliant. Yeah, thank you. Virginie, would you like to go next?
Yeah, so for me, systemic design is the encounter of like system thinking and design. So it's really where you start to cross. I imagine that design is bringing like its way of making things more accessible because we have actually huge knowledge on the system thinking, system dynamics, and so on. But for years, it was very difficult to put that in practice. And for me, this is where, and the system design group, this is where we see the power of design is to bring it more like to the ground and to your office. And I think that actually it's extremely important because as we are all living it now, we are in a big shift, and this shift demands a change of perspective. We need to start to think more in design. I'm referring here to the work, for example, of Joanna Macy, who is like in a croisière, in a croisade, sorry. Yeah. Like she called the great turning, and I think that design can really participate to that.
Brilliant, thank you. And yeah, Tom, what are your thoughts?
Okay, yeah, big question. I much appreciate and agree with what Christelle and Virginie have just said. Like to add another angle in here, that the purpose of doing this, right? For a lot of people, systemic thinking, systems thinking can be a bit daunting, and there's complex words in it. It requires a certain abstract level of thinking that may not be familiar to everyone in the beginning. And the reason why we are doing this is if you depart from the perspective that we all understand that a better world is not just possible, but it's also necessary, that our society is becoming increasingly complex, automatically due to the layering of more people on the planet, as well as more systems of production, of consumption, of economics, of social interaction, you name it, intersecting each other. For us to do something meaningful, to do something that will not just solve something just for tomorrow and then maybe become part of the problem the day after tomorrow, but for something to actually have a long-lasting positive effect. There are very few other tools available than systems thinking and systemic design. So from a goal-oriented perspective, it almost becomes a necessity if you want to contribute to a positive, sustainable, social, equitable world, to use looking into systems and trying to understand them as a departure point to help define what the problem is in the first place, and to help you figure out what possible steps you can take to make a significant improvement. Yeah.
Brilliant. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's interesting. And you've all kind of touched on this in terms of kind of how it differs from design thinking in kind of its conventional sense. But I think given that this is potentially an area that's more familiar with a lot of our audience, are you able to elaborate a bit more on kind of what you see as the core differences? You know, and obviously you said it brings in systems thinking. You know, what is it, would you say, about systems thinking that can be so valuable to design, and how does that tie into what design thinking is about? Who would like to kind of start with that?
I can start with that.
Mm-hmm.
For me, the big eye-opener was when I saw a video of Russell Eckoff, where it's called "If Russell Eckoff Would Have Given a TED Talk," and it explains beautiful what it means. I mean, a system is a whole. He says consistent of parts that are interconnected, and because of that interconnectedness, there is an emergent behavior that is not intended by any of the parts, but because of the interaction of the parts. And so that's for me the big difference. As a designer, we are used to look at parts. We design products, we design services. In systemic design, we try to see the whole and the influence on everything on each other. And we try to see how this leads to a good or a bad emerging behavior.
Great. Yeah. Yeah, Virginie, did you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I would look from, I agree with Christelle, of course. I will add the posture angle, maybe, that I think it's bringing designers probably in a different attitude, because once you're conscious of the complexity of the things, I think it's like putting you in a position of humbleness, probably, and of more collaboration. So many people now use this expression, but I think it's coming from Otto Schramer, like to move from ecosystem to ecosystem. And I think in design, it's extremely true, because we all have like very big creative ego, and probably like to try to step out and to have a look at the whole, and to realize that we need to collaborate, and maybe our interventions in the system might not change the system. I always feel a bit awkward with this idea of changing a system. I don't know, maybe Tom, you want to continue on that?
Yeah, of course. I mean, one of the things I think that I identified with as a designer, product designer and architect, that there's a huge drive from our discipline to make stuff, to see stuff built and to have something in your hands and to point at something and say, yeah, we built this, we made this, this came from my design table kind of situation. And that's a natural feeling. And I think that we as human beings, we have evolved with the concept of the object and the relationships with objects between each other. And design is particularly sensitive to that way of thinking. I think that systems thinking is something that comes in naturally from several angles in the design discipline. First, when you're asking the question, why are we doing something in the first place? What I was referring to earlier, like, you know, do we want to build a gadget that sells, or do we want to improve the lives of people for the long run? Those are two different questions. And systems thinking will come in when you ask the latter much more than if you ask the first. Secondarily, as supply chains are becoming more complex and our desire to create more circular design supply chains, this is something that where systems thinking also naturally jumps in, because supply chain, you can see it as a system and you can treat it as such. Thirdly, with the social interaction component, like who makes what decision in the process of realizing something, for example, doing something in the public space or making a policy change or something like that, then you're affecting different actors, and those actors then affect the system. And that allows you to look at the world as a system again. So there's all of these different entry points that actually come quite naturally for the designer to get a grasp on systems thinking. And I think that this is why it's also one of the fields that's kind of leading its tangible implementation. Because, you know, systems thinking has been around since the 50s and 60s, and it has had a profound influence on our society with, you know, the easiest examples are the Club of Rome and the Brundtland Committee forming the whole idea of climate change and those sorts of things. But within design, we've been lagging behind on that part when it was just basically large international policy making. But there have been attempts over the years to implement that, and it's reaching a further stage of maturity. So I think that we're not at the beginning. I think that we are very much a long way ahead, but we still have a lot to do. And that's where Christel's systemic design toolkit, for example, is incredibly powerful to help people that are visual thinkers that work in co-creation with one another to use these templates to explore different aspects of a system. And once you understand that, you can never fully understand the system, but you can grasp kind of its nature and learn from its nature to try to implement positive change, then it becomes a creative exercise rather than simply an analytical one, which is often misunderstood. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I think a couple of themes stood out for me there, you know, in terms of asking how would we describe the difference between design thinking and systemic thinking. And one was that it seems like the focus is a bit different. So, you know, I remember, Tom, you were saying, you know, design often just focus on like an object, you know, is this phone, and we'd made this phone, for example. But actually, as you kind of alluded, Virginie, that sometimes is about taking more of a, not necessarily abstract, but looking maybe at the system, like the connections between objects, like the perspective of the designer is a bit different. And you also mentioned about as well, it's going from potentially this egocentric to an ecocentric. So it's not only looking at the system in a different way, but it's treating your own relationship potentially in a different way as well. Sorry, Christel, did you have something you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, I just want to add something on what Virginie said about changing the system. And it's true, as a designer, you are not changing the system. You are empowering the system. You are giving the system the ability to change itself. And that's also a big difference, because as designers, we are used to design a closed project, to hand over a solution to the client. And that's not what you do in systemic design.
No. Are you able to elaborate a bit more then? How would you describe this different approach if you're not designing, or if you're not changing the system, you're kind of empowering it? How does that kind of happen in practice?
Well, what you do is at the end, you come up with an intervention model, with a mix of interventions, with a lot of variations, which the system can then adopt or not, depending on its context, and work with it. And of course, you also give the actors in the system a new way of looking at the system, at looking at the perspectives, at not looking at one side or another side anymore, but at everything together.
Yeah. Did anybody else have anything to add to that while we're on this topic? Just aware.
I mean, design thinking and systems thinking, they blur into one another. There are components of design thinking that are systemic in nature, and there are components of systems thinking that have a design process as its primary kind of activation process. So there's definitely a blur there, but I do agree with you, Bowen, in what it's a shift of focus. One of them focuses on society as a system which you're trying to learn and which you're trying to empower, as Christel says, in order to activate societal positive change. And the other one tends to be a little bit more about ending up with something material that you can point to, or a piece of software, or a thing. And I think that there's a shift, and that shift is happening with many designers. And I think also designers often think that they're the one that know the best when they're in the room. A typical nature of I would say architects, maybe more than industrial designers. I'm sorry, fellow architects. It's my humble impression of my own profession. But
we might get some thumbs down in the comments if there's any architects among us.
Sorry.
Just kidding.
Something that I really appreciate from systems thinking, systemic design, let me say that, to kind of acknowledge the value of both systems or design thinking and systems thinking, is the value of a multidisciplinary approach. That the scientist has something important to say, the policymaker has something important to say, the users have something important to say, the designer, the engineer, the social worker, you name it. and to give all of these different roles and perspective a place within the process to help see the issue from multiple perspectives and to help start exploring the system to see where there are opportunities for empowerment or enrichment or transformation is a very essential component of the whole story. And I think that that's an essential element of it, that the designer is good at helping to manage the process, and for those who are visual thinkers to help visualize it and to create an actionable pathway forward. But the other disciplines bring equally valuable things to the process, and that needs to be taken into account.
Interesting. So yeah, as you were saying, it's not just thinking that, you know, for example, I have this role in this project, say I'm the designer or something, so therefore I know best even in this specific domain, but it's about almost not necessarily in a way kind of decentralizing, but kind of almost becoming the platform as maybe as a designer, whoever, to kind of bring in the different perspectives. Would you say that's it?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I think that it's also helping to don't always jump on the let's make something new, but rather like step out, look what is already existing, and how can you build better interaction between these things. So how can you use the value and the resources who are already there and stop throwing things away or ignore them. Sometimes it's just because you ignore it.
Interesting.
And Virginie, I want to add something to that. It's even so that when there is an issue in a system, in general, there are a lot of things already emerging. So what you really have to do is to look at what's emerging there, trying to see what's the DNA that makes it work and trying to connect it. And my theory is that if nothing is emerging yet, then probably the system is not ready for change. So you cannot do anything about it. Or there is a dictator who makes sure that nothing can change.
It happened.
Yeah, or you're looking for that hidden lever that's sleeping in the background. I like finding those, you know, after that thing that everyone ignored and just is in everyone's blind spot. That, you know, with this small measure, I like the term acupuncture. I mean, it conflicts a little bit with Crystal's definition of empowerment, but which I really like. But you'll never know everything about the system, but at some point you find these knots of energy or these knots of friction or something or other, and that's something that you can use. Whether or not it's negative or positive doesn't matter. So you inventorize the points of where there is an energy for change, and if you are able to connect them in a series of subsequent events to kind of trigger each other, then you kind of get like this avalanche moving, that with very small measures you can create a huge change.
And that's what I mean with the emerging initiatives. These are those acupuncture points.
And the examples of that are always really inspiring.
Mm-hmm.
Christelle, may I ask a question? Christelle, I'm very interested because already last time you were talking about DNA in system context, and I'm very curious to maybe if you can a bit enlighten about that, because I'm not totally familiar with this part of your work or this notion of DNA.
That comes from a researcher of Goethe. He was looking at the plants, at the leaves, and he discovered that basically there are certain archetypical leaf forms, and they have enough variation in their DNA to adapt to different contexts. So depending on the light, the type of soil, the other trees in the neighborhood, the leaf will grow completely differently. The shape will be completely differently. And it's a bit the same principle that you do in systemic design. You try to find this variety that is necessary to give the system enough material to adapt, to be resilient, to change, depending on the context.
Thank you.
Yeah. And so that's Crystal has been working in, systems thinking, system design for a very long time, and very quickly when you go into this field, you'll run into these words that have synonyms that you find, which makes it even confusing. So the word resilience is used a lot. The word we use, for example, we identify a sustainable system as one that is both resilient, autonomous, and harmonious. And each one of those words are then subdivided into, yet again, smaller words. For example, for resilience, the measure of diversity of the system, the measure of flexibility of the system, the measure of transparency of the system. And each one of them allows you to kind of look at a specific component of how the dynamics of a system works. And in each and every case, it's different. So what diversity means, I mean, diversity of what? Diversity of its components, diversity of its interactions, diversity of the age of the people that are involved, diversity of the disciplines. You can keep on going. And it's, in the end, it's just a bunch of lenses for us to look at reality and make some sense of it, but also understanding that you'll never know everything. And it's that balance between being comfortable in acting in a way where you'll never be sure, but you are a hell of a lot better informed than if you didn't do it if you didn't do it. And that becomes interesting. And so in a sense, it is really all about creating a language. It's a vocabulary between each other, so that when Crystal says, this and that may increase the resilience of a system, then I understand and I can communicate and help to look for kind of things that may help the resilience of the system. But for that, we need to kind of have, not perfect, but we need to have more or less the same understanding of what resilience means and what harmony means, or social justice and things like that. And that's something that we see actually happening in the outer world that has not necessarily much to do with design. For example, the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations, which is this fantastic thing. You can have a lot to say about it, about good things or bad things about it, but it's there. And so we have these goals, and they help us to at least identify that sustainability is not one thing like water or energy, but it's these multiple different things that we need to keep in balance. So one thing may affect water, but it may negatively affect hunger or something like that. And so you need to keep track of the whole system and its relationships. And that means that measuring these different indicators becomes a challenge. And that didn't used to be a challenge for designers. But as designers are being asked to also kind of show what societal impact their projects have, those worlds are starting to come together. So the world of impact measurement, true value, natural capital accounting, that sort of stuff is coming together with design thinking and systems thinking and complexity thinking and so on. And that is a super interesting domain, because then with design thinking, you can start helping impact measurement. And if you do that in a smart way, you can accelerate other people's work around the planet. And that's really, I think, a systemic way of thinking that's really empowering.
Okay, there was a lot of interesting stuff that came out of that. I think one thing, just because it follows on from the last thing you were saying, Tom, is that there seems to be this interesting kind of convergence around some different fields, which of course has led to the underpinnings of systemic design, of which you could say itself maybe comes from a combination of design thinking and systems thinking, which in itself is a conglomeration of many different things. I think that's a very interesting takeaway. Another thing that you said that we kind of talked about is it's about understanding these systems are complex, and that it's not about understanding the ultimate truth, that through a certain step-by-step process, you can see it. And as long as everybody understands that this is the right way of viewing it, then we all get it. It's not quite like that. And it ties, but yet you need, but it helps that you've done it. And it definitely helps with that view. And this ties in with quite an interesting question we have from the audience, which I think could be a good time to talk about, which is, the question is, if the system is complex, which is where, you know, it's many complex systems are kind of unknowable because they're too complex to even understand, then how are we to understand or map a system to get to an understanding? And maybe to add on that, how do we know when it's kind of good enough to act upon? Crystal, would you be interested to start with that?
Yeah, that's a difficult one. Technically, there's an easy answer. There are a lot of ways to map systems, like the causal loop diagrams or other diagram tools. But one of the difficulties is to have the right boundaries of your system, because it's easy to fall into the trap to stay looking at the system as it is, with the linkages and the connections that it has today, and to forget to look at other systems that are not connected yet, but might be very important to solve the issues. So that's a very good one. And then of course there is also the level of detail, but that's easier. Normally, if you do like 20, 30 interviews and you add on this data from papers and research, you end up with like 600 variables. And after 600, you start to have doubles.
Mm-hmm.
The boundaries is really a difficult one.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And yeah, Virginie. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
No, I was just going to talk about boundaries too. It was really the thing coming to my mind. So please, Tom, go.
It's one of my pet questions. I love it. In the book, which I'm shamelessly going to plug again, which is a free download, by the way, there's a story about a dog. We call him Lubas, the dog. At least someone in my workshop yelled Lubas and the name stuck. There's an interesting analogy to be made. When you have a pet, let's say you have a dog, you want to understand and you want to make sure that dog is healthy and is happy. Now, a particular kind of systems analysis would measure his heart rate, measure the amount of hairs on his body, would measure the amount of humidity content of its skin, its amount of breaths, its T cell count of its blood, and so on. And the more data you have, the more you would hope that you will know whether or not your dog Lubas is healthy or not. It requires expensive equipment. It requires a huge amount of data. It requires a lot of time and a lot of expensive expertise to do this. And this is what we would call bottom-up or deterministic way of looking at a system, which can be extremely valuable. So I'm not saying that that is not a good way of looking. It is very valuable and it's usually necessary at some stage. But if you want to know if your dog is healthy or happy, you just study its behavior. If it is crying in the corner, then there's probably something wrong. And if it's happily bouncing around and just, you know, being its usual self, then there is less worry that there is something wrong. So your primary indicators on the health of your dog are something that we take completely for granted. And that is that as human beings, we're very good at analyzing these complex systemic behaviors when they are concentrated in something that we can identify with, like a dog or maybe another person, because each person is a complex system for sure. Now, if you can transfer that way of thinking, let's say, to a city or a national policy or something like that, if you stop staring blind on all these numerical indicators and start looking more at the kind of behavioral patterns that a certain system shows, then very quickly you can get to much more meaningful perspectives. And then once you go deeper, once you, for example, have determined that, yeah, there is actually something wrong with my dog and he's limping on his left foot, well, then let's go and get the deterministic way of thinking out and let's analyze on a focused area to see if there's more information to be had to inform our perspective. But those two will never fully meet. So you can't really perform the most expensive, the most fantastic bottom-up deterministic systems analysis thing in the world and then get to an organic complex systems thinking perspective. You can't. And there's this wonderful film that I sent around called All Watched Over by Machines of Love and Grace, Part 2. And
I would highly recommend.
Yeah. It looks like it's an old film, and you know, the voice may sound a little bit boring to some people, but it's worth its weight in gold. And the example that they had of this research group for I think more than a decade spent analyzing and inputting numbers into a computer system of this one ecosystem, and the more numbers they put in, the less the systemic responses of the computer system were aligned with the actual natural occurrences. So there's actually an absolute limit to how much determinism you can put into an analysis. And in those two, there is a question of boundaries. So the boundaries are not necessarily about how deep you want to go or how many parameters do you want to look at, but the boundaries, I think, to a degree are also like, which kind of behaviors do you want to find? Within what stakeholders do you want to find them? What kind of lenses are you choosing to look through in order to find things that you can perhaps act upon? And those are different kinds of questions than the idea of system boundary, where you say, oh, we're going to look 20 years into the future, 3 degrees deep, and we're going to look at these and these and these systemic indicators. And there's that balance. Yeah.
Yeah, brilliant. So just to attempt to kind of summarize some of the main points in the answer to the question of, given that complex systems are knowable, how do we kind of know them to the extent that it's useful, and how do we know that? It was an interesting that some of the things that popped up was, first of all, that it's not just about, well, one thing, Crystal, you mentioned, it's about setting the right boundaries is very important. How do you frame it? And Tom, you kind of built on that in that it's not just getting more of things. Yeah, and Crystal, you mentioned this as well. It's you know, it gets to a point where there's duplication. That could be one sign. There's just a lot of data, and you kind of seem to be saturating that. But also, this is kind of, what question are you asking? Which stakeholders do we get that from? Is very important, because the question changes what you discover about the system. And also, Tom, what you emphasized was that it's not just about getting more and more and more data to the point where you can have all the data in the world about a complex system in a deterministic way, but actually you've potentially got this huge blind spot just through, for example, observation, or like a more qualitative, for example, way of observing, which can also be extremely valuable. Brilliant. So that's been very enlightening. I think it could be an interesting time now to just reflect a bit on some practical examples. I mean, because I know that, you know, each of you have got, you know, really interesting experiences in enacting systemic design in whichever ways you do it yourselves. So I think it would be really interesting for the audience just to hear, you know, are you able to kind of summarize a story of when you have, you know, approached a situation using the methodologies of systemic design, and, you know, how it has helped to lead to a good outcome? So Virginie, would you like to kind of kick this off?
Yeah, so as my expertise is more on code design, I'm going to make the warm-up. With systemic design group, we choose like the position to act more into the diffusion of the knowledge, so to make things more accessible. So mostly we are doing workshops with very basic mapping level, but it's really like just to have people grasping this idea of what is systemic design. And so we are a bit door openers. And quite often I do a game that I've been doing at the Schumacher College. Everybody here know it probably. It's the constellation game. But I would really recommend to people who don't know it to do it. It's more or less, you place yourself between, you take a crowd, you need to be at least 30, it's nicer. And you ask to each participant to focus on 2 people in the crowd. and to stay in the middle, so in between these two people. And then you ask 2 or 3 people to start to move. And then you will start to have your crowd moving. And so and if you are in the conference or if you have a large group, it's incredible because suddenly you see interaction is happening and how things are moving together. And it's a very nice way of feeling things. And this is the kind of little games we do, like, and each time we have like people who are like, wow. We have another one, and I think it's quite interesting, like to reveal like all these notions around resilience. It's more a permaculture game. It's you ask a round of people to take the position of something in the nature. So you can be a bird, I can be a tree, and so on. And then you start to build relation with a rope, and you continue, and so on. And then for the first part, I leave it here in general. And then I start again the game, and I ask people to be something in a social ecosystem. So you can be the bank, I can be the bakery, you can be the brewery, and so on. And then again, we build links. And at a certain point, as a facilitator, I'm going to cut somewhere. And the people who were like continuing in this logic to multiply their relation with different elements, they're still connected. Some people were focused on the bank. And so building only relation with this one. And it's a very physical way to make people realize that they need to diversify and multiply. And last example, it's still a workshop story. It's a workshop was conducted by my colleagues Jan Vick and Fabian Gamp. And it was with a neighborhood association. And so, the question was like about participation. You know, like now at the level of cities, we have more and more of this participatory process, but it's not always working, and comes out of that a lot of frustrations, and it was really amazing, I think, like as a group, to see that you had this group of people who were a bit stuck in the situation and starting to don't know exactly what to do, and just by mapping. So it's a simple exercise where you start to put things in connection and understand the relations and the patterns and dynamics. And first, it's making people better. And you see that in the room, because, you know, it's not my fault. It's not the fault even of my neighbor. So we have to continue to collaborate. It's just that maybe we are not connecting the right things at the right moment. And it's really visualizing. And this is why I think this is the power of like systemic and design, is to really like, you feel and you see what normally we don't design, like all these in-betweens, all this relation.
Fascinating. Yeah, thank you. No, thank you for that. This kind of embodied, this embodied realization. And of course, yeah, you mentioned about the systems mapping as well. It's fascinating. Thank you. Yeah, Crystal, would you like to share some stories?
Yeah, again, I want to refer to Russell Eckhoff. I really like this guy. And he speaks about idealized design, and basically it's for me, it's a very strong concept. That's, you start your project, or very soon in your project, you ask the group to make a picture or a presentation of the ideal future they have. So what would the system ideally be? And I do this, for example, through a metaphor, asking them, can you draw a picture of what the system is today and what it should be for you? Or I also use another tool which is called the value proposition, which is available online from a Dutch professor, Elke de Oude, where with the group, you elicitate the value that you want to create on different levels and on different perspectives. And it's a very strong, because on the future, on the ideal future, until now in my workshops, nobody disagreed. They all want the same. It's about the how that they disagree. So if you put the what first, then it's much easier to come to the how and to agree on that. It was even so that in one of the workshops that I had, where I used the metaphors, the group was really distrusting each other. And by this exercise, within 10 minutes, the distrust was gone because they saw that everybody wanted the same. It's very powerful.
Wow. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. And Tom?
Yeah, I have a million stories. Do we have a million minutes? Maybe in addition, because Crystal gave a great example of how important it is that you know how powerful co-creation can be if you do that together, including the important stakeholders, setting a goal correctly. Virginie is talking about embodying and experiencing systems through these physical exercises. There's also, I'm sure you're all aware of it, but for the audience, there's a nice book, it's red, and it's called the Systems Thinking Playbook. And it has a lot of these exercises in it that are quite wonderful. Maybe I can give a kind of an example of a real world project where it made a significant difference in the world. Let's see if I can do that in 2 minutes. IKEA approached us once and they said, here's the IKEA catalog, and I want you to make it more sustainable, but you're not allowed to change anything about it. So the same number of pages, the same content, basically the same paper type and all of it, but still we would like you to make it more sustainable. And also PricewaterhouseCoopers and Deloitte have both already broken their heads on this for the past 5 years and they can't get any further. So can you guys with your 6 staff members do this for like nothing? So it's one of those design challenges where you go like, yeah, okay, let me sleep on that for a night. But what we did is we did together with the product owner at IKEA, Mathieu, who was great in the process. Together with him and some other people from IKEA, we did kind of like a repeated system mapping exercise on what is the supply chain of the catalog, how do the ideas that go into it get to be, who does the tendering for the printing and the paper and the ink and the pulp, and just kind of explore the system from a lot of different places. And at some point we had made all these system maps and it was beautiful, but we couldn't really find this trigger point that we all felt that there was some kind of a possibility. And what we started to do, we started mapping the amount of influence that each one of the actors in the whole production process has on the sustainability impact. So not who has the most power officially, but who has the most impact on the sustainability score. So not like expressed in CO2 or whatever, but in, I don't know, influence points or something. And we basically could very quickly determine that this was kind of sat with 3 people that sit in an office in Sweden, and they determine in 1 week every year who exactly gets to print or produce or transport this catalog. And they had an immensity of data available, like this deterministic way of thinking of more than 300 parameters from water to CO2 to holiday days and waste components and emissions and so on. But each year they only had 1 week to determine that for more than, I don't know, 50 or 60 different transactions. And that was completely mind-blowing, and they could only really focus on one. So what we did is we developed a very small little tool that just simply visualized all of those different impacts across the board in one image. And that image immediately shows kind of lots of it is good, lots of it is bad, some of it is in the middle kind of stuff with basic colors. And that allowed them to very quickly, within fractions of a second, to use a different part of their brain, kind of their pattern recognition rather than logical deduction, to determine, oh, these bunches are pretty good and these are over the board pretty bad, even though the single parameter that I was looking at may be all over the board. And by implementing this, they started having huge benefits in their sustainability score without increasing their cost. And then the second step that was done was that the suppliers started to receive such an image back for each time that they apply to a tender. So not just the suppliers that got the actual assignment, but also any supplier that will be participating in this, which is hundreds around the world of the largest paper producers in the world. And they started getting back performance reviews over all of these parameters and seeing where their competition was anonymized and seeing where they wanted to go. And that created a massive revolution within the whole paper and printing industry that is still rippling through to this day. And it basically cost IKEA about €500,000 to do it. And within 1 year, they already had more than, as far as we could estimate, more than 52 million in benefits the first year. And that started accelerating every year after that. And that's one of those systemic triggers where you go like, yeah, we found this piece of acupuncture, we exploited it, and the world is a better place for it. In the end, I think in the first year, we saved more energy than the entire state of South Carolina uses every year, just with this one little tool. And that's fantastic. I love it. Yeah.
Wow, that's fascinating, and it ties, this idea of the leverage points, and and what Crystal was talking about before, that it's not about changing the system necessarily. Sometimes the most valuable thing you can do is actually just raise awareness or make something visible that was previously blind to people within the system, and that can lead to the world of difference. Thank you. I'm aware that we have a few minutes left. I'd love to, bring a bit more of the audience questions. We've had quite a bit of engagement today, and so one of the questions is, sometimes one hasn't the position to design the system. Do you have examples of doing systems thinking from the inside? So this could be at a small scale initially, and from there inspiring it to use it at a larger scale. So when it's difficult to kind of try and affect too many things at one time, have you had examples of starting small and scaling up from there? Who would like to start with that?
I can start on that. We did a project about diversity in Flanders, where we worked with civic organizations, a lot of people who are trying new stuff. They don't have a lot of money. And so the idea that we told them to do is, you don't have to start with a big bang. You start with something small, with your intervention model, but you make sure that your thing that is small is connected. It's not about, we will now start with this activity. You should start with everything, all the leverage points, we call them. So all the acupuncture points at once, but in a very, very minimal version. And you start to experiment with it with friends, because we don't want the outside world to kill your baby yet. And then you start inviting neighbors that won't kill it either, but could be critical friends. And so you progress and you invite more and more people gradually. So at the end, you are strong enough to put your idea in the big system. And in the meantime, you connect as much as possible, of course.
Interesting. Thanks for that. Any other thoughts on that question?
Virginie, do you want to go?
No, go.
Well, it's a bit of an interesting question, because what do you mean with small and large? Is it like the people, or is it the thinking, or is it the impact? What I like that we did this project that is now realized, I'm quite happy to realize, is the San Francisco Salesforce Park. It's a park of 1.2 kilometers long and 400 meters wide. It's a real ecologically activated park on the 8th story of a transport terminal. And we developed that concept 15 years ago, and only now it was built. So that was nice. But in our design process for that, we basically, the whole thinking of how a public park that increases biodiversity and recycles water can be a feasible business case for a very expensive piece of real estate in the middle of one of the most expensive cities in the world. And we kept that all to ourselves with the whole design team. And once we figured it out, we knew we were going to be blown out of the water if we went public without having an answer to that question. So we all figured it out in a small committee until we found it, and we closed the business case. And what we did is we leveraged the the added value of the surrounding property by building such a park as a collateral to finance the park itself. And to do that, we were able to do that, and it's a public park, even though it was the most expensive construction project in the history of the United States. And those are nice. But then, yeah, we kept it with a small group of people and only went public when we knew the answer to the critical questions. It's not my preferred way of doing it, but it's how that worked.
One thing I found quite interesting there that you said, Tom, as well, is that, you know, in a way, you created this feedback loop so that, you know, it was financed by the thing that was growing, and it just kind of almost self-reinforces itself. And it seems to have some links as well with what you were saying, Crystal, about as it scales, you bring people that are more trust, and, you know, you don't start with trying to do all the difficult things at once. Brilliant. And so this question is, what is the role of courage in working for systems change? Courage for a practitioner. How much importance are values given in the understanding of systems change, or value, I guess, of in general? Yeah,
like,
whoever would like to answer, yeah.
Or systems change for evil, because you can use it in that way, of course.
Mm-hmm. Of course, everybody here is not using it for evil, just to clarify for everyone in the audience. But yeah, would you like to expand on that, Tom?
If you're trying to, if your intention is to positively affect society through design, then it is the most important thing. But that may not be the leverage point for a lot of people. Not a lot of people are trying to do that, but an increasing amount are. And I think that the more and more you see that systemic design and design thinking is grabbing a foothold, you see that this rising awareness of that societal necessity. And in that, it's the absolute foundation. And courage is as well, because you have to dare to stand up and say something different. And yeah, that's tough. Yeah,
thank you. And next question. So unless anybody had anything to add to that? No? Okay. So this question is, I always think about, in relationship to systemic design, is whether you can call what's happening there design anymore. If it's something that's so transdisciplinary and you bring so many different things in, you know, why do we still call it design? And I guess it's kind of like, how valuable is this way of framing, and to what extent is it applicable, I guess, in the context that you guys have used it?
I can answer to that.
Yeah.
It's true that the systemic movement can merge a lot of disciplines, but the role that we have as designers within this systemic thinking is that we still can make products and services that can help to change. For example, information platforms are very powerful, or products that are much more sustainable and make it happen, for example, that people in India are better paid and don't have the toxics in them when they are making the products. So it's more about that mindset. And then another role of designer is, of course, the one of being a facilitator in workshops, bringing people together to have a dialogue and visualize to make this dialogue more interesting and more graspable.
I will continue on that line and to say, like, of course, like we've been evolving like from design to co-design, and there is this like we used to design for, and now more and more we are designing with. And what we are designing here is the process, it's the tool, it's the grammar. I know that Christelle has been named a grammar maker, designer. So, and I mean, design is a very old activity for humans. So you will see it a bit everywhere. So this is why it's probably difficult to say this is design, this is not design. And yes, in this context, I think it's still design, even if it's challenging because it might be more abstract. and more difficult to grasp what we are doing exactly, and probably more difficult to sell.
Mm-hmm. Brilliant. Well, I'm aware we're just a minute over time now, but I feel that the least we could do to kind of, for the listeners today who, some people may be quite new to this, some people may be like, I love this, I want to learn more, I was curious if you guys have any kind of final thoughts to share, and also, do you have any advice for people who want to learn more or do more practice around this, and where they can go for more kind of learning and advice, I guess, in this field? So Tom, would you like to start with that question?
Yeah, use Crystal's Systemic Design Toolkit. Go to the website, download it, look at it. And if you look at those templates, as a designer, your fingers should start to itch to just find your own way with it. Second of all, download this one, and then don't read all of it because it's too much. There's also a quick guide. This is open source and free. Symbiosis in Development has a combination between the theory behind it, the method by which you do it as a designer, and the process that you can use as a team. And you can actually use the Systemic Design Toolkit like this. They can work together, and even where they are complementary to one another, you can try out the different ones. I think that's good. Watch that movie that I recommended. Did you put it in the description?
No, but I'll add it as a comment afterwards. Thanks for the reminder.
Good. That was a good one. And then my favorite book of all time, for those of you that are involved and concerned about basically the larger problem of humanity growing on this planet, and the large movements and dynamics of societies and cultures on this world, is the book by Joseph Tainter called The Collapse of Complex Societies, which is a systemic view at population growth and complexity. And I think it is fascinating, and it was eye-opening for me. And there's even, I think, a free online 1-hour lecture that he gives in some university that you can use as a cheat sheet.
Fantastic. Well, yeah, that's a lot of interesting stuff there. Virginie, Crystal, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I would recommend to read the paper Leverage Points of Donna Meadows, which is really a good one. Then to look into the soft system methodology of Checkland. Mm-hmm. That's also a very interesting one. And then for the advanced systemic design in people, you can also go to the RSD website, which is the Systemic Design International Conference. And there is a lot of interesting material, but it's for people who are already know the basics, because otherwise you are lost.
Okay, thanks for the heads up. And Virginie, just to add to this digital bookshelf that we're painting for our listeners.
I will add like the perspective of like more living systems. So I would recommend, of course, to try to listen. Fritjof Capra is not always very accessible, but I think like his view is very valuable. And one more time, it's someone I really like. It's Joanna Macy. I don't think she's like recognized as a system thinker, or maybe, but I think the way she's talking about system and connection and this need of connection is really amazing and inspiring. So I really recommend her work around like the work that reconnect. I think it's really amazing. As designers, it's fantastic, especially if you want to make change.
Amazing. Well, a huge thanks to all of you for taking the time today. I've gotten a huge amount of value from it, and yeah, just a big thank you. And yeah, I'm aware we're over time, so we'll end the webinar there, but I hope everyone enjoyed it, and thanks for joining us as well for those who joined at home. So thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you. Goodbye. Au revoir.
Bye.
Bye.